The first snow of November drifted across the mountains as Nathan Cole guided his freight wagon toward the dusty streets of Silver Creek. The little frontier town was already preparing for winter. Shopkeepers hurried to stack firewood outside their stores. Mothers gathered children before the wind turned bitter, and ranch hands crowded the general store, buying enough flour, beans, and coffee to survive the coming months. Nathan had never cared much for towns. They were noisy places where everyone knew everyone else's business. Ever since his father's death 5 years earlier, he had found more comfort in open valleys than in crowded streets. Out on Pine Ridge Ranch, the cattle never asked questions, and the mountains never judged a man for keeping to himself. He had come only because winter demanded supplies. His wagon now carried sacks of flour, cured bacon, lamp oil, fresh horseshoes, blankets, medicine, and enough coffee to last until spring. Every purchase had been carefully counted. Living alone meant wasting nothing. Nathan climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "Time to head home," he muttered to his bay gelding. The horse snorted impatiently. Before Nathan could urge him forward, something shifted beneath the canvas covering the rear of the wagon. A soft rustle, then silence. Nathan frowned. The wagon had been still only moments before. He slowly climbed down, one hand resting near the revolver on his belt. Years of ranch life had taught him not to ignore strange sounds. The wind whistled between the buildings. Another movement. Whoever, or whatever, was inside was trying very hard not to be heard. Nathan stepped to the back of the wagon and pulled aside the heavy canvas. A young woman stared back at him. She couldn't have been older than 23. Chestnut-colored hair had escaped its pins and framed a frightened face dusted with snowflakes. Her blue dress was wrinkled and smeared with mud along the hem, while one of her boots had nearly come apart from running. She clutched a worn leather satchel tightly against her chest. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Nathan had never seen her before. She studied him with desperate eyes, searching for any sign that he might call for help. Instead, he simply asked, "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." "Then why are you hiding in my wagon?" Before she could answer, the distant sound of galloping horses echoed through the street. Her face turned pale. She leaned closer, lowering her voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "They're looking for me." Nathan glanced toward the main road. 4 riders appeared between the buildings, stopping people one by one. The woman swallowed hard. "Please," she whispered. "Pretend I'm your wife until we're outside town." Nathan blinked. "My what?" "My husband." He almost laughed from surprise, but the fear in her eyes stopped him. This wasn't mischief. She truly believed those men would drag her away. The riders were getting closer. Nathan looked back at her. "I don't even know your name." "You don't need to. I might." She hesitated. "Clara Dawson." "Nathan Cole." She gave a nervous nod. The horses were nearly upon them now. Nathan made his decision. "Lie down." She obeyed instantly, disappearing beneath the blankets and supply sacks. Nathan pulled the canvas closed just as 4 armed riders surrounded the wagon. The man leading them wore an expensive black coat trimmed with silver stitching. Unlike the others, his beard was neatly groomed, and his polished boots suggested he spent far more time giving orders than following them. "Afternoon," the rider called. Nathan tipped his hat. "Afternoon. You heading north?" "Back to Pine Ridge." The rider glanced toward the covered wagon. "We're searching for a young woman." Nathan waited. "She has brown hair," the rider continued. "Blue dress. Left town without permission." Nathan answered calmly. "My wife is riding in back." The rider raised an eyebrow. "Your wife?" Nathan nodded without hesitation. "She's been sick since morning. Didn't want the cold wind hitting her." The man studied Nathan carefully. "You mind if we take a look?" Nathan's expression never changed. "My wife doesn't enjoy strangers staring at her while she's ill." For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then the canvas shifted. Clara slowly pushed it aside, just enough to reveal her face. She forced a tired smile. "Nathan," she said softly, "are we almost home?" She spoke his name so naturally that even Nathan nearly believed they'd been married for years. The lead rider looked her over carefully. Then his eyes dropped to the delicate silver necklace around her neck. Pretty necklace for someone traveling in a freight wagon, he remarked. Clara smiled faintly. It was my mother's. Her answer came so quickly that even Nathan couldn't tell whether it was true. The rider narrowed his eyes. Something about the situation bothered him, but nothing proved she wasn't exactly who Nathan claimed she was. Finally, he stepped aside. You two have a safe trip. Nathan flicked the reins. The wagon rolled forward at an easy pace. He resisted every urge to look behind him. Only after they reached the edge of Silver Creek did he risk a glance. The four riders remained in town, watching, waiting. Nathan didn't take the northern highway toward Pine Ridge. Instead, he turned onto an old logging trail that twisted through the mountains, a road few travelers still used. Only when the town disappeared behind towering pines did Clara climb from beneath the blankets. She let out a slow breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. You chose the long road, she said quietly. Nathan kept his eyes on the winding trail ahead. I figured anyone chasing us would expect the short one. For the first time that day, Clara allowed herself the smallest smile. It seems I hid in the right wagon. Nathan remained silent. After a long pause, he finally asked the question that had been waiting since he lifted the canvas. So, who exactly are you running from? Clara remained quiet for several moments, watching the snow-covered trail disappear beneath the wagon wheels. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and frozen earth, while the last rooftops of Silver Creek faded behind them. Finally, she spoke. My father owned a small piece of land along Miller's Creek, she said. After he died, everything was supposed to become mine. Nathan listened without interrupting. Victor Blackwood wanted that land. I've heard the name, Nathan replied. Then you've heard enough. She stared down at her hands. He loaned my father money during a bad harvest. We believed it was an ordinary loan. After father's death, I discovered the debt had somehow tripled. Every paper I signed seemed to create another payment. When I refused to sell the land, Blackwood offered another solution. Nathan already knew the answer before she said it. He wanted to marry you. She nodded. The wedding was supposed to happen this afternoon. The wagon creaked over a frozen stream. I ran before sunrise. Nathan tightened his grip on the reins, but said nothing. What will you do now? He finally asked. I don't know. It was the most honest answer she could give. Neither of them spoke again for nearly an hour. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like two strangers slowly deciding whether trust was possible. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains. Nathan glanced toward the western ridge. We're not going to make the ranch before the storm. The first heavy snowflakes began falling. Within minutes, the trail vanished beneath white powder. The wind howled through the pines, driving the snow sideways. Nathan urged the horses forward until an old trapper's cabin appeared between the trees. There, he said. The weather-beaten cabin had stood empty for years, but Nathan occasionally used it during cattle drives. Together they hurried inside before the storm swallowed the trail completely. The cabin was simple: a stone fireplace, one wooden table, two stools, and a narrow sleeping loft. Nathan immediately gathered firewood, while Clara brushed snow from her coat. I'll start the fire, he said. I'll find something for supper. She stepped back into the storm without waiting for permission. Nathan was surprised. Most people would have stayed beside the warmth. A few minutes later, she returned carrying flour, cured bacon, coffee, and a small sack of potatoes from the wagon. Before long, the smell of frying bacon filled the tiny cabin. Nathan watched quietly. She moved with calm confidence, measuring flour without wasting a handful and stretching the meal far enough for both of them. You've done this before, he observed. My father believed everyone should know how to survive. Nathan nodded. A wise man. They ate beside the crackling fire while snow buried the world outside. For the first time since leaving Silver Creek, Clara relaxed. Thank you, she said softly. For what? You never asked whether I was telling the truth. Nathan looked into the fire. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She smiled faintly. Most people ask questions before they've earned the answers. The storm lasted all night. By morning, the mountains glittered beneath fresh snow. The road to Pine Ridge Ranch was difficult, but Nathan knew every bend of the trail. Near midday, they finally rode through the entrance gate. Clara stared at the ranch in silence. A sturdy log house overlooked rolling pastures surrounded by pine forests. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, while a weathered red barn stood against the white hills. It wasn't grand, but it felt safe. Nathan climbed down first. "You can stay until the roads open again." Clara shook her head. "I won't live here as a burden. I didn't say you were one. I'll earn my place." Nathan studied her determined expression. "There isn't much to earn. There always is." The next morning she proved it. Before sunrise, she was already sweeping the porch. She repaired a broken kitchen shelf without being asked. She mended torn curtains using a sewing kit from her satchel. When she discovered an injured mare limping inside the stable, she carefully cleaned the wound and wrapped the leg with fresh bandages. Nathan watched from across the barn. "You've cared for horses before. My grandfather raised them. It shows." Within a week, the house looked different. The windows sparkled. Fresh bread cooled on the kitchen table. The fireplace stayed warm without smoke filling the room. Small repairs Nathan had ignored for months quietly disappeared. Nothing dramatic. Just dozens of little improvements that slowly transformed a lonely ranch into a welcoming home. Nathan found himself lingering inside longer each evening instead of eating quickly and retreating to the barn. Conversation came naturally. One night, while splitting firewood together, Clara asked, "Have you always lived alone?" Nathan rested the axe against the chopping block. "My father died 5 winters ago. I'm sorry. After that, it was just me." Clara nodded. "I know what an empty house sounds like." Nathan looked at her. She understood. No further explanation was needed. As the weeks passed, they developed quiet routines. Nathan left small notes on the kitchen table before heading out with the cattle. "Need more firewood near the west fence." When he returned, another note waited, already stacked before lunch. Sometimes he wrote, "The creek may freeze tonight." She answered, "I filled every water barrel." Their conversations often happened through scraps of paper instead of spoken words. Oddly, it suited them. One snowy evening, Clara confessed a dream she had never shared. "I always wanted to open a small school," she said. "Somewhere children could learn without traveling 50 miles through the mountains." Nathan smiled. "I always thought this ranch was too large for one man." Neither realized it then, but the long Montana winter was quietly healing wounds that neither of them had believed time could mend. Outside, snow continued to blanket Pine Ridge Ranch. Inside, 2 lonely lives were slowly becoming one shared home. Winter settled heavily over Pine Ridge Ranch, wrapping the valleys in deep snow and silence. Days blended into weeks as Nathan and Clara worked side by side, their lives following the steady rhythm of ranch work. Every morning began before sunrise. They fed the horses, checked the cattle, chopped firewood, and repaired whatever winter had damaged during the night. Neither of them noticed exactly when the ranch stopped feeling like Nathan's home and slowly became theirs. One afternoon, while cleaning the small upstairs room Nathan had offered her, Clara opened the old leather satchel she had carried from Silver Creek. Until now, she had avoided looking through it. Every item inside reminded her of the life she had left behind. There were a few dresses, her mother's silver locket, a family Bible, and several folded papers tied together with faded blue ribbon. She untied the ribbon carefully. Most of the documents were ordinary receipts and letters written by her father years earlier. Then one folded envelope caught her attention. It had never been opened. Across the front, in her father's handwriting, were 4 simple words. For Clara, if necessary. Her heartbeat quickened. She unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Inside, her father explained that he had begun to suspect Victor Blackwood was altering loan records. He had secretly copied several contracts before his death because he feared something was terribly wrong. "There are names I do not trust," the letter read. "If anything happens to me, take these papers to someone who understands the law. Never give them to Blackwood." Clara searched deeper inside the envelope. Several copies of contracts fell onto the table. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Then she noticed the dates. The repayment amounts on the copied contracts were completely different from the ones Blackwood had shown her after her father's funeral. Someone had changed the numbers. Someone had forged the debts. Nathan found Clara sitting silently beside the window that evening. She handed him the papers without saying a word. He read each page carefully. His expression hardened. "These aren't mistakes," he said quietly. "They're proof. The signatures match. So do the original payment amounts." Nathan looked toward the fire. If these copies are genuine, Blackwood built his entire claim on forged contracts. But who would believe us? Nathan thought for a moment. "I know someone." The following morning they rode through fresh snow to a neighboring valley where retired Judge Samuel Harper lived in a modest farmhouse. The old judge had served the territory for nearly 30 years before retiring. His eyesight had weakened. His judgment had not. He spent nearly an hour studying every document through a thick magnifying glass. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "I've seen this trick before." Clara looked up hopefully. "You have?" Harper nodded. "A man changes one page, keeps the signatures, and hopes nobody ever sees the originals. Can we prove it? If these copies came from your father before the alterations?" The judge replied, "Then yes." Nathan asked the question both of them feared. "Will Blackwood wait for the law?" The judge gave a humorless smile. "Men like Victor Blackwood rarely do." Nathan and Clara left with renewed hope. Judge Harper promised to write directly to the territorial authorities and request a formal investigation. For the first time in months, Clara believed she might actually recover her father's land. But Victor Blackwood moved faster than either of them expected. 3 days later, Nathan was repairing a fence when he heard horses approaching. Not one, not two, an entire group. He climbed the hill overlooking the ranch road. 7 riders emerged through the falling snow. At their center rode Victor Blackwood himself. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black wool coat, he carried himself like a man accustomed to getting whatever he desired. The riders stopped inside the ranch yard. Nathan walked forward calmly. "What brings you here?" Blackwood smiled. "I've come for Miss Dawson." Clara stepped onto the porch behind Nathan. "I'm not going anywhere." Blackwood ignored her. "She belongs in Silver Creek." Nathan folded his arms. "She's staying here by her own choice." Blackwood's smile disappeared. "You're interfering in private business." Nathan answered evenly. "Not anymore." The wind carried silence across the snow-covered yard. Then Blackwood spoke again. "You have no idea who you're standing against." "I know enough." Blackwood reached into his saddlebag and removed several folded documents. "According to these papers, Clara Dawson owes me enough money to lose everything she owns." Nathan didn't even glance at them. "We've seen the real contracts." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's face. It vanished almost instantly. "I don't know what lies she's been telling you." "They aren't lies," Clara said, stepping beside Nathan. She held up her father's letter. "I have copies made before you changed the debts." Blackwood's jaw tightened. For several seconds nobody moved. Then another sound echoed across the valley. More horses. Everyone turned. 5 neighboring ranchers rode through the gate. Leading them was Daniel Brooks, whose ranch bordered Nathan's land. Behind him came the Turner brothers, old Mrs. Lawson's sons, and Jacob Reed. Daniel guided his horse beside Nathan. "We saw 7 armed riders heading this way," he said. "Thought you might appreciate company." Nathan gave a grateful nod. Blackwood slowly realized the balance had shifted. He had expected one rancher. Instead, he faced an entire valley standing together. Clara stepped forward, holding the copied contracts high enough for everyone to see. "My father kept these before he died," she announced. "Judge Harper has already examined them, and the territorial authorities have been notified." Several of Blackwood's hired men exchanged uneasy glances. One rider quietly backed his horse away. Another lowered his rifle. None of them wanted to be remembered as men defending forged documents. Blackwood looked from the papers to the ranchers surrounding Nathan. His confidence began to crack. "This isn't over," he warned. Nathan met his gaze without raising his voice. "It already is." Blackwood jerked his reins sharply. "Let's go." One by one, his riders turned their horses and disappeared into the swirling snow. The ranch fell silent once more. Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Nathan looked toward the distant mountains. "They'll investigate now." Clara nodded. And this time, she folded her father's letter carefully against her heart. We finally have the truth on our side. Spring arrived slowly in the Montana mountains. The heavy snow that had buried Pine Ridge Ranch for months melted into clear streams rushing through the valleys. Wildflowers pushed through the damp earth. The cattle wandered into fresh green pastures, and birds returned to the forests as though winter had never existed. For the first time in months, hope felt stronger than fear. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since Victor Blackwood rode away from the ranch. Neither he nor his men had returned. One warm afternoon, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley once again. Nathan stepped onto the porch. This time only 2 riders approached. They weren't carrying rifles across their saddles. Instead, silver badges reflected the afternoon sunlight. Territorial marshals. The older marshal climbed down first. Nathan Cole. Nathan nodded. I'm Marshal Henry Lawson. He extended his hand before continuing. We've completed our investigation. Clara stepped quietly onto the porch beside Nathan. The marshal removed several folded documents from his saddlebag. Judge Harper's testimony, your father's original copies, and statements from former employees all tell the same story. Clara held her breath. Victor Blackwood forged debt records for years. The marshal nodded. He altered contracts, threatened families into surrendering their land, and bribed local clerks to hide the changes. Nathan glanced toward Clara. Tears filled her eyes before she even heard the rest. The court has declared every fraudulent contract invalid. The marshal smiled. Miss Dawson. He handed her the official papers. Your father's property has been legally restored to you. For several seconds, Clara simply stared at the document. Months of fear, months of running, months of believing she had lost everything, ended with a single piece of paper. She closed her eyes and whispered, Father, we did it. The marshal continued. Victor Blackwood attempted to flee south 2 days ago. Nathan looked up. They caught him. They did. He'll stand trial before the territorial court. The younger marshal added with a grin. And I don't believe he'll own another acre of land after this. The 2 officers tipped their hats and rode away, leaving behind something the ranch hadn't known in a very long time. Peace. That evening, Nathan found Clara sitting beneath the old cottonwood tree overlooking the western pasture. She held the official land papers in her lap, but wasn't reading them. Instead, she watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. You won, Nathan said as he sat beside her. She smiled gently. It doesn't feel like winning. No. It feels like finally breathing again. Nathan understood. Some battles didn't end with celebrations. Sometimes they simply ended with silence. Several days later, Clara began packing the few belongings she had brought to the ranch months earlier. Nathan noticed the neatly folded dresses resting on the bed. Her sewing kit had already been tucked inside the leather satchel. So, he asked quietly, You're leaving. Clara, stop packing. My land is waiting. Nathan nodded. It is. Neither spoke again. The room suddenly felt much smaller than before. That evening they shared supper almost entirely in silence. The familiar laughter that had filled the kitchen during winter seemed to have disappeared. After washing the dishes, Nathan stepped onto the porch. Clara followed a few moments later. The stars stretched across the Montana sky. I can drive you to Miller's Creek tomorrow, Nathan said. She looked at him. And then, you'll have your land. My school. A fresh beginning. She waited. And you? Nathan looked toward the dark outline of the barn. I'll come back here. You say that like it will be easy. It won't. She stepped closer. Then why are you pretending it will? Nathan laughed softly. Because I'm not very good at saying what I really mean. She folded her arms. Then say it. For a long moment, only the wind answered. Finally, Nathan spoke. When you arrived, this ranch was just a place where I worked. He looked toward the glowing windows of the house. You repaired broken shelves. You filled empty rooms with laughter. You left little notes on the kitchen table. He smiled to himself. I used to hurry through supper. Now I hope it lasts another hour. Clara's eyes glistened. Nathan took one slow step toward her. I told myself all winter that I was simply helping someone in need. He shook his head. The truth is, he paused. I don't know how to live in that house if you aren't in it. Clara smiled through her tears. I was hoping you'd say that. Nathan blinked. You were? She nodded. I finished packing because I wanted to know whether you'd let me leave. He laughed in disbelief. So, you weren't planning to go? I planned to hear the truth. Nathan reached into his coat pocket. He wasn't carrying a fancy ring, only a simple silver band that had belonged to his mother for many years. I don't have a speech prepared. She smiled. I've noticed, but I do have one question. He gently held out the ring. Clara Dawson. His voice was steady. Will you stay at Pine Ridge Ranch? He smiled warmly. Not as my guest, but as my wife. Before he finished the sentence, Clara threw her arms around him. Yes. The single word carried every hope they had quietly built together through the long winter. They were married 6 weeks later beneath the cottonwood tree where Nathan had proposed. Neighbors from every ranch in the valley attended the ceremony. Judge Harper proudly signed the marriage certificate. Even the territorial marshals returned to offer congratulations. Clara officially reopened her father's land, not as another cattle ranch, but as the small country school she had dreamed about since childhood. Children from nearby ranches filled the little classroom each morning. Nathan expanded Pine Ridge Ranch with the help of neighbors who had become lifelong friends. The lonely house that had once echoed with silence now rang with laughter, conversation, and the comforting sounds of a family finally finding its place. Years later, travelers passing through the valley often heard the story of the rancher who unknowingly carried a frightened runaway bride out of Silver Creek in the back of his freight wagon. Most people believed it had been luck. Nathan always disagreed. It wasn't luck, he would say with a smile. It was one small decision to help a stranger. And sometimes he would glance toward Clara as she stood outside the little schoolhouse surrounded by smiling children. The smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of the life you were always meant to find.